Hey guys! Tonight we're creeping down a quiet stone corridor, past heavy wooden doors and flickering candlelight, into a world where silence wasn't just golden, it was mandatory. We're stepping into the midnight routines of medieval monks. And before you ask, no, they didn't sleep much. In fact, you're about to discover just how little shut-eye it took to reach heaven back then. This isn't the part of medieval history with swords or saints or dragons. This is the part with cold stone floors, bare feet and bells that ring at 2 o'clock in the morning, because apparently that's prime praying time. And just so you know, you probably won't survive this. Not physically, not spiritually, and definitely not if your idea of sacrifice is skipping dessert. Because these monks woke up in the middle of the night, on purpose. They chanted for hours in the cold, in silence, and then did it again the next day. Why? Well, let's just say the soul was never meant to sleep comfortably. So before you get cozy, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. No vows of commitment necessary, just click it. And while you're here, drop a comment with what city you're watching from and what time it is right now where you are. I'm always curious to see who's drifting off where in the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's quietly exhausting journey together. You might think of sleep as a necessary human activity, a non-negotiable break in the day's rhythm where your body recharges and your mind retreats into dreams. But for Leonardo da Vinci, that wasn't quite how it worked. At least that's how the story goes. Today we begin in the slow shadows of the late 15th century. Imagine the soft stone walls of a Florentine workshop, the smell of beeswax and linseed oil in the air, the quiet shuffle of parchment, the occasional creak of a wooden stool. In one corner of the room, hunched over an impossibly detailed sketch of a human skull, is Leonardo, not surrounded by the applause of patrons or the chaos of invention, but by stillness, and perhaps the faint sound of a yawn. Leonardo da Vinci, the celebrated polymath, lived in a world that was just beginning to define what it meant to be Renaissance. Yet he never seemed to have enough time. Anatomist, painter, inventor, military engineer, cartographer, he was, by any standard, impossibly busy, and if the legends are to be believed, he found a curious solution to that problem: polyphasic sleep. This is the practice of dividing sleep into multiple short naps throughout the day, skipping the long, singular nighttime sleep most of us are used to. The most extreme version of this approach, referred to now as the Uberman schedule, supposedly involves sleeping just 20 minutes every 4 hours. According to some biographers and internet lore, Leonardo did just that. But did he really? Before we try to answer that, let's step back and understand the world he lived in. Sleep in the 15th century wasn't quite like sleep today. In fact, it was often divided naturally into 2 blocks. Historical records across Europe, from medical texts to diary entries, describe a first sleep and second sleep, separated by a period of wakefulness in the middle of the night. During that time, people might pray, smoke, read, or even visit neighbors. So perhaps Leonardo wasn't so radical after all. Perhaps he was simply experimenting with a slightly more intense version of what many were already doing. His notebooks, thousands of pages of scattered thoughts and cross-hatched diagrams, don't offer a sleep journal, unfortunately. But they do suggest something else: a man obsessed with time. Across hundreds of entries, Leonardo muses on the movement of water, the weight of air, the velocity of falling objects, and the futility of wasted minutes. He once wrote, "A well-spent day brings happy sleep, but not a long one, apparently." For him, sleep wasn't a pleasure, but a negotiation. Time was not to be surrendered to sloth. Yet Leonardo was not merely concerned with the scientific measurement of time. He was immersed in it. He painted slowly, agonizingly slowly. The Mona Lisa took over 4 years. The Last Supper, plagued by his stubborn refusal to use traditional fresco methods, crumbled almost immediately. He abandoned commissions regularly. It seems, in a curious irony, that for a man who may have slept less than anyone else, he never had enough time to finish anything. This brings us to an interesting contradiction. Was Leonardo truly a model of relentless nap-powered productivity, or was he a man forever fighting against his own nature? Let's imagine his daily routine, pieced together from letters, accounts, and scattered notes. Leonardo awoke, not with the sun, but often before it. He may have begun by observing birds, one of his many fascinations, or practicing mirror writing. His breakfast would have been modest, perhaps dried figs, flatbread, or a bit of sheep's cheese. By mid-morning, he was either drawing anatomical sketches, drafting impossible war machines, or debating philosophy with young artists. And then, according to some, he napped. One source, the Codex Atlanticus, includes references to rest and work patterns, but none explicitly confirm the polyphasic schedule. Still, the legend persisted. In the 20th century, the myth of Leonardo's sleep pattern was revived, with books and articles celebrating him as a model of biohacking, centuries before the term existed. His supposed 20-minute naps every 4 hours were framed as a key to unlocking genius. But did anyone around him confirm this? That's harder to say. Giorgio Vasari, the first great art historian, wrote about Leonardo with reverent admiration, but no mention of a strange sleep cycle, nor do letters from patrons complain of inconvenient napping. On the contrary, many complained of his habit of disappearing entirely, going months without completing assigned works. Perhaps the truth was more mundane than magical. Perhaps Leonardo wasn't a model of perfect efficiency, but of something else, obsessive curiosity. Still, it's worth noting that Leonardo often drew figures asleep. In his anatomical studies, he rendered the face in deep rest, the muscles slack, the lids heavy. He was clearly fascinated by sleep, not just as a biological necessity, but as a state of vulnerability, beauty, and mystery. What did he dream of? No records remain, but his writings hint at a mind that blurred the boundaries between rest and wakefulness. Even his most famous inventions, flying machines, robotic knights, water elevators, read like lucid dreams rendered in ink. One wonders whether his fragmented sleep, if real, was not a discipline of time management, but a way of dipping in and out of the unconscious, harvesting strange images from the silence. But we still haven't answered our question. Did Leonardo da Vinci truly sleep in polyphasic intervals? Or is this just one of many myths built atop the towering uneven legacy of a man whose mind overflowed with ideas faster than his body could execute them? In the next section, we'll step away from Leonardo himself and explore the broader sleep culture of the Renaissance. What did people believe about sleep and health? How did doctors, monks, and peasants regulate their daily rhythms? And what exactly did sleep mean to a civilization still half in the dark? To understand Leonardo's rumored sleep habits, we need to step away from the individual and peer more broadly into the society that shaped him. Sleep, in the Renaissance, was not only a biological act but a cultural phenomenon wrapped in superstition, shaped by religion, and bound by the slow rhythm of candlelight. Let's begin with the setting. Imagine a Renaissance household in northern Italy. The walls are thick and cold to the touch, built for insulation rather than beauty. The air smells faintly of tallow candles, straw and smoke from the central hearth. The floors are uneven, often just packed dirt or rough stone, and the furniture, while functional, is sparse. Bedrooms, as we think of them, did not exist in every household. Wealthier citizens might have had a designated bedchamber, often shared by multiple members of the family. The poor, on the other hand, slept wherever there was space, on benches, straw pallets, or in communal dormitories. Nighttime was governed by darkness in a way we can scarcely imagine today. Without electricity, and with candles expensive or inconvenient, most activities wound down after sunset. Night was a realm of shadows, and sleep was a way to pass through it. But interestingly, it wasn't always taken in one continuous block. The concept of segmented sleep, or biphasic sleep, appears in sources across pre-industrial Europe. It seems that many people slept in two phases: a first sleep that began soon after nightfall and lasted for a few hours, followed by a period of wakefulness, and then a second sleep until dawn. What did people do in the interval between these two sleeps? Quite a lot, actually. Some would pray or meditate. Others might write, talk with family, or if you were lucky enough to have one, read by firelight. There are accounts of farmers checking on livestock, bakers beginning their work, even neighbors visiting one another. The space between first and second sleep was liminal, peaceful, and oddly productive. It may have been during such hours that Leonardo conducted some of his quietest, most contemplative work, but the Renaissance was not a monolithic period. Sleep varied depending on your class, your occupation, and your beliefs. For instance, monks adhered to strict sleep schedules broken up by mandatory prayers throughout the night. The liturgy of the hours required that monks awaken at specific times to chant or read scripture. In this way, their sleep resembled the modern polyphasic model, though not necessarily by choice. Meanwhile, physicians of the era offered advice on how and when to sleep based on the humoral theory. According to Galenic medicine, the human body was governed by 4 fluids or humors, and imbalances in these could cause illness. Sleep, diet, and even posture were thought to affect the balance. It was widely believed that sleeping on one's left side would allow the body's natural heat to process food better, while sleeping on the back could invite nightmares or demonic visitations. Leonardo, being a student of both art and anatomy, was certainly aware of these beliefs. Whether he followed them is another question entirely. He had a tendency to dismiss tradition when it suited him. For example, while most artists painted religious scenes based on well-established iconography, Leonardo brought an unsettling humanity to his subjects. Expressions that hinted at secrets, gestures that felt curiously modern. In the same spirit, it's easy to imagine him dismissing the sleep advice of medieval doctors in favor of his own experiments. Still, even he would have understood the deeper, more symbolic dimensions of sleep. In Renaissance art, sleep often carried moral weight. A sleeping figure might represent innocence or vulnerability, but also laziness or ignorance. In dreams, people were believed to receive divine messages, warnings, or even premonitions of death. Leonardo was fascinated by dreams, not because they were mystical, but because they were gateways into the workings of the mind. We know that Leonardo dissected more than 30 human corpses in his lifetime, searching for the physical roots of thought, emotion, and memory. His notebooks are filled with sketches of the human skull, the optic nerve, and even speculative diagrams of how ideas might travel through the body. For him, sleep wasn't just rest, it was research. It's possible that Leonardo adopted fragmented sleep, not because it saved time, but because it allowed access to more transitions between waking and dreaming, those soft edges where the conscious and unconscious begin to blur. He wouldn't have been alone in this. Artists, mystics, and scholars throughout the period kept dream books in which they recorded the strange visions of the night. Some sought inspiration, others guidance. Leonardo, who believed in observing everything, likely treated dreams as one more data point, a reflection of the body's internal landscape. So what about the famous 20-minute naps? This idea, so popular in modern discussions of polyphasic sleep, doesn't appear in Renaissance texts. There is no clear evidence that anyone followed such a rigid structure of short naps, spaced evenly across the day. However, the idea of the siesta or midday rest was widespread. In warmer climates like Italy, it was common for people to take short breaks in the hottest part of the day, especially laborers. Leonardo's own schedule, if reconstructed, suggests bursts of intense work followed by periods of reflection. He was known to leave projects incomplete, disappear for days, and obsessively return to old notes years later. If he napped often, it may have been less a system than a habit, a byproduct of long hours spent standing over paper, lost in thought. We return then to the question of myth. Did Leonardo da Vinci truly follow a rigorous polyphasic sleep pattern, or did later admirers craft the idea to explain his genius? It's entirely possible that the truth lies somewhere in between, that Leonardo's sleep was irregular, fragmented, and experimental, like everything else he did, that he rejected long sleep, not because it wasted time, but because he was chasing something else, an insight, a moment of clarity, a problem finally solved while the world around him slept. But if sleep was a tool, what did he use it for? Did these strange patterns of rest make him more creative, or more restless? And what were the costs of such a life? In the next section, we'll follow Leonardo in the final decades of his life, his move to France, his last great patron, and how age shaped both his body and his sleep. We'll explore the legacy he left behind, not in masterpieces, but in pages of forgotten anatomy sketches and curious side notes about fatigue, breath, and the mind's nocturnal wandering. By the early 1510s, the air in Florence had shifted. The Renaissance was maturing, and so was Leonardo da Vinci. His once youthful presence, marked by brilliant conversation, graceful posture, and a keen eye for beauty, had softened into something slower, more deliberate. He was in his 60s now, a respectable old age by the standards of the time, and though his mind remained sharp, his body began to betray him. Records suggest that by the time he reached France, under the patronage of King Francis I, Leonardo's right hand had become partially paralyzed, likely from a stroke. For a man who had once filled entire notebooks with sketches of motion, of flight, of ceaseless observation, the stillness must have felt unfamiliar. But let's pause here and set the scene. It is 1516. You are in Amboise, France. The Château du Clos-Lucé is quiet, except for the distant chatter of courtiers in the gardens and the muted clink of a servant preparing tea. Leonardo lives here now, in a fine manor house gifted to him by the French king, who refers to him affectionately as my father. The artist room is filled with familiar objects, bundles of unfinished sketches, a mechanical lion made for court entertainment, rolled up anatomical diagrams that would remain unpublished for centuries. And somewhere in this calm, away from the glitter of court life, Leonardo still naps. Did he still follow his peculiar sleep rhythms in old age? We do not know. There are no diaries from these final years, no precise schedules, but we do have scattered notes, some even written in reverse mirror script, about exhaustion, about memory, about the brain and its mysterious functions. One particular note from the Codex Arundel reads, "As a well-spent day brings happy sleep, so a well-employed life brings a happy death." It is unclear whether this is a confession, a philosophy, or just a passing observation, but it suggests that Leonardo was reflecting on sleep and mortality as one and the same, both essential, both full of mystery, both tied to how one spends their time awake. His notebooks in this final period drifted more and more into the abstract. Gone were the grand military designs or architectural blueprints. In their place, water studies, metaphors of the heart as a pump, careful dissections of the eye, musings about shadows and dreams. He wrote about the pineal gland, believing it to be the seat of the soul. He pondered how dreams arrived, through which channels, stirred by which bodily fluids. He even tried to map out how thoughts traveled from sensation to memory. The Renaissance was not ready for neuroscience, but Leonardo was thinking about it anyway. It's easy to romanticize this period. The old master quietly dying in a foreign land, still scribbling into the night while the king hosted banquets across the courtyard. But it's also worth remembering how unfinished his legacy felt. Many of his greatest scientific works were never published. His flying machines never left the ground. His theories about water and blood would not be proven for centuries. And yet, even in this period of decline, Leonardo's fascination with the balance between wakefulness and rest remained constant. There is some evidence, for example, that he advised young apprentices on how to structure their workdays for maximum concentration. He told them to pause often, to let their minds return to the problem from a new angle, to sketch with light hands but heavy attention. In this way, one could argue that his approach to sleep and to thought were inseparable. Rest was not laziness, it was the reset button, the recalibration of perception. Perhaps this is why he resisted the full night's sleep, not because he wanted more time, but because he wanted more entries and exits, more chances to touch that hazy line between reason and dream. In the last weeks of his life, Leonardo began organizing his papers. His assistant and companion, Francesco Melzi, helped sort the vast piles of notes and diagrams, many of which had never been seen by anyone else. It is likely that during this process, Leonardo spoke of sleep again, not as a theory, but as a coming experience. We know from a royal document that he died on May 2nd, 1519, reportedly in the arms of King Francis I. Whether this poetic image is true or not is uncertain. Some historians doubt the king was actually there, but the idea of the great artist, finally resting, after decades of fractured sleep and insatiable inquiry, feels strangely appropriate. He left behind only a handful of finished paintings, but thousands of pages of thought about bodies, about nature, about light, and repeatedly about how the mind flickers into silence. His polyphasic sleep patterns, whether real or exaggerated, seem almost symbolic in retrospect. Leonardo da Vinci wasn't trying to hack time. He was trying to live differently within it, to notice more often, to pull knowledge from both waking and dreaming, and to let the two speak to one another. And while we may never know whether he truly napped every 4 hours, we do know this. He believed that no part of life was too small to examine, not even the strange, quiet hours when nothing happens, when breath slows, when light dims, when the mind turns inward. And perhaps in those still hours, he finally saw something he could never quite paint, the shape of rest itself. You've likely done laundry before, sorting socks, adding detergent, pressing a button. It's a minor inconvenience, a background task in a day of many. But imagine a world without buttons, or detergent, or even running water. Imagine the act of cleaning clothes not as a chore, but as an entire lifestyle. Now imagine doing that in the middle of a crowded, mud-caked medieval town, where clothes were heavy, Water was scarce, and the smell, well, let's just say it didn't help. Welcome to the daily life of the medieval laundry maid. In a society with rigid class hierarchies, few occupations sat closer to the bottom than this one. It was work given to widows, orphan girls, and older women who could no longer serve in noble households. But don't mistake low status for low importance. Everyone needed clean linens, especially the wealthy, and the laundry maid was the one who made that happen. Slowly, methodically, with blistered fingers and a nose permanently dulled by ammonia. Let's set the scene. You are in a small English town in the late 14th century. It's early spring, mud season, and your day begins before sunrise. The floors of your small cottage are still damp from the night's cold. You pull on a coarse woolen overdress, patched at the elbows, and wrap your feet in cloth strips for warmth. There are no clocks, but you can tell by the rooster and the foggy hush that it's time to begin. A large pile of soiled linens waits by the hearth. First step, water. Depending on your location, this might mean a walk to the town's communal well, the riverbank, or if you're lucky, access to a rain barrel. But water is heavy. One bucket can weigh up to 20 kilograms when full, and you'll need several for rinsing, soaking, scrubbing, boiling, and then comes the lie. Most medieval laundry relied on a strong alkaline solution made from ashes. Yes, ashes. Specifically the white ash left from burning hardwoods. When mixed with water and left to settle, this created a kind of primitive soap. The process required experience. Too weak, and the clothes stayed filthy. Too strong, and the fabric could dissolve. The laundry maid had to know the exact look and smell of a perfect batch, an intuition built through years of repetition. But soap, in the way we think of it, was a luxury. Most peasants and even many lower nobles relied on this ash-water mixture for their basic washing. Soap was sometimes available in chunks, fat boiled with wood ash, but it was expensive and reserved for the very dirtiest stains or the wealthiest clients. Once the water and lye were ready, the real labour began. Washing clothes in the Middle Ages was not a gentle activity. It involved scrubbing with stones, beating with paddles, and if you had access, boiling in large copper pots over open fires. There was an entire lexicon of tools: the beetle, a wooden mallet; the washing dolly, a kind of stick for stirring; the scrubbing board, if you were rich; and rough brushes made of hog hair or plant fibers. Laundry wasn't done every week. It wasn't even done every month in some cases. Most people owned only a few garments, and undergarments, shifts, chemises, hose were often worn until they could stand up on their own. So when laundry day did come, it meant tackling weeks or even months of accumulated dirt, sweat, and frankly bodily fluids. This wasn't just fabric care, it was sanitation. And for noble households it was also presentation. A stained camise or yellowed ruff could damage a reputation. Which is why noble women often had dedicated laundresses in their staff, women tasked with handling only the most delicate items: lace, silk, embroidered underclothes. These maids were expected to know how to remove wine stains without fraying gold thread, how to sun-bleach linen without making it brittle, and how to fold garments to avoid creases that suggested laziness. Yes, even your folds could be judged. But the conditions were far from glamorous. Laundry was typically done outdoors, near rivers, in icy wind or blazing sun. The washerwomen often stood knee-deep in water for hours, skirts hitched up, their hands red and raw. In winter, the clothes could freeze before they dried. In summer, the smell of damp wool and human residue turned the riverside into a noxious place. It's no wonder laundry maids rarely lived into old age. The work was brutal and sometimes deadly, not to mention the risk of theft. Clothes were valuable, and stolen garments could be resold or traded. Many towns imposed strict regulations about when and where laundry could be hung to dry. In some places, washerwomen were required to register with the town council, and disputes over lost or damaged garments were common in court records. But there were quieter, more personal aspects to the job too. Imagine folding a nobleman's shirts, freshly rinsed in rosemary water, knowing he would wear one to his lover's chambers that very evening, or boiling the undergarments of a local priest, knowing the rumours that swirled around his private life. The laundry maid saw everything: bloodstains, perfume, hidden embroidery, poorly repaired tears. In many ways, she knew the household more intimately than any servant or steward, and yet she remained nearly invisible. There are few names, few stories, Most washerwomen disappeared into history without so much as a note. What we know comes from account books, legal records, and the occasional satirical poem. Yet their labour held society together in the most literal sense, thread by thread. As we finish this first section, you might ask, why did anyone do this job? Why wake before dawn to drag buckets, beat linen, scrub stains, and risk sickness or injury, often for the equivalent of a few pennies? In the next section, we'll follow one such laundry maid through her working week. Based on historical documents and reconstructed from real case studies, we'll explore her daily schedule, the relationships she navigated, and the quiet pride she took in her work. Let us now narrow our view. Rather than float above history, let's step gently into it, into the worn leather shoes of one particular laundry maid. Her name, as we'll imagine from surviving English records, is Agnes. She lives in the outskirts of York in the year 1372. Agnes is not famous. She will not be mentioned in the chronicles of kings or clergy. Her name appears only once in a town ledger, where it's recorded that she was paid 2 farthings for cleansing 4 gowns and 1 bed linen of the Lady Fitzrobert. Yet from this faint fingerprint, we can build something more. Not fantasy, but a mosaic from fragments of wages, tools, calendars, church rules, and domestic routines. Agnes represents thousands of women who kept noble collars white and petticoats aired while never sitting at the tables they served. Her week begins on Sunday, but not with laundry. Like most in 14th century England, Sunday is reserved for worship. Agnes attends Mass at the small church down the hill. Not in a fine seat, but standing at the back, near the doorway. Her dress is rough spun, and her apron still carries the faint scent of lye. She says her prayers, nods to familiar faces, and silently counts in her head the households she must visit that week. Monday is the gathering day. Agnes rises before dawn. She pulls her woolen cloak around her shoulders and heads out to collect garments from her employers. She knocks quietly at the Fitzrobert home, where a house servant hands over a bundle tied with hemp cord. It contains night shifts, underlinen, and several tablecloths marked with wine stains. At Mistress Alwyn's house, she's asked to scrub blood from a servant's smock. No questions asked. By mid-morning, Agnes has taken in 5 orders. Her shoulder aches from the weight of the laundry sack. She returns home, boils water over the hearth, and begins sorting. Whites to the left, coloured items to the right. Linen is prioritised. Wool can wait. The fire hisses, the steam clings to the low ceiling, and the cottage smells of wet cloth, ash and rosemary. Tuesday is soaking day. The garments are soaked in large wooden tubs filled with warm water and wood ash. Her homemade lye. She stirs the mix with a long stick, taking care not to splash her arms. While the clothes sit, she beats stained garments against a flat stone slab beside the small brook that runs behind her cottage. Her hands go numb from the cold, and her knuckles split slightly by midday. She binds them with linen scraps. The entire process takes hours. There is no break for lunch, only the occasional heel of bread dipped in watery ale. At sundown, she hangs the items on a cord strung between 2 posts. The damp linen flutters like pennants in a war she never asked to fight. Wednesday is scrubbing and boiling. Today, Agnes tackles the worst of the items. The ones that smell, the ones that make her gag, the ones that must be handled with gloves she stitched herself from old leather. She uses a mix of soapwort and stale urine for particularly tough stains. This may seem appalling to the modern nose, but ammonia-rich urine was one of the most effective stain lifters available in the Middle Ages. She stirs a pot over the fire, boiling undergarments slowly. A fine sheen of sweat settles on her upper lip. She must be careful. The fabric can easily scorch. Her tools include a paddle, a coarse bristled brush, and a cloth stone for smoothing frayed edges. The garments hiss and bubble. The cottage fills with a heavy, sour scent. By evening, her arms ache, her dress is damp, and her feet wrapped in rags are blistered. But the pile has shrunk. This brings a kind of quiet satisfaction. Thursday is rinsing and drying. Agnes carries the laundry down to the river, half a mile away. She lays out the linens on flat rocks or suspended them on lines near the bank. She is not alone, other washerwomen work nearby. They nod in recognition but speak little. There is competition here. Too many laundresses, too few wealthy clients. Rumours of undercutting prices and sabotage drift on the breeze, as do more scandalous tales. Maids who lost garments for coin or added perfumes to noblemen's clothes to deliver secret messages. Agnes keeps to herself. She works quickly, carefully, watching the sky for signs of rain. If a storm rolls in, her entire week's work could be ruined in minutes. Friday is mending. With the clothes dry, Agnes examines each piece for tears, missing buttons or frayed seams. She is not paid for this, but skipping it risks complaints and lost business. She threads her needle with care and patches small holes, pressing seams with a heated flat stone. Her fingers are stiff but precise. She takes pride in this part of the job. She imagines her stitches noticed, not by the wearers perhaps, but by other laundresses. She imagines a whispered compliment. Agnes keeps a straight line. It's a quiet, secret badge of honor. Saturday is delivery. Wrapped in linen cloth and tied with hemp, the garments are delivered back to their owners. Agnes walks door to door. Sometimes she's offered a crust of bread or a cup of ale as thanks. Occasionally she's paid late. She accepts it all without complaint. By the time she returns home, the sun is setting. She unties her apron, sets aside a few coppers, and warms her feet by the fire. She doesn't read. Few women like her were taught to, but she hums a little tune, one she's heard since she was a girl, and she thinks perhaps of the garments she'll see next week. Through Agnes, we see a life lived not in glory, but in persistence. Her work is invisible, uncelebrated, but essential. She is a keeper of domestic dignity, a silent witness to human bodies and lives. In blood, sweat, and lavender water, she carves out her place in the world. But how did society view women like her? In the final section, we'll explore the social perceptions of laundresses in the medieval world. The jokes, the judgments, the quiet warnings wrapped in literature and law. We'll also follow what happened when laundry went wrong. Stolen garments, scandals, and court cases that reveal just how seriously the business of washing could be taken. In the medieval world, laundering wasn't just a chore, it was a social minefield. While the task itself was monotonous, grueling, and largely invisible, the role of the laundry maid sat at a curious crossroads between the private and the public, the noble and the common, the trusted and the suspected. By now, you've walked with Agnes, watched her hands turn red in icy water, felt the weight of lye-sodden linens against her back. But what of how others saw her? How did a woman who handled noblemen's undergarments, slept near boiling cauldrons, and caught whispers of household secrets, fit into the hierarchy of the medieval mind? Let's begin with how she was written about. In literature and ballads of the time, the laundress was often a figure of contradiction. On the one hand, she represented cleanliness and domestic service. On the other, she was frequently mocked or suspected of promiscuity. The very nature of her work, handling intimate garments often wet, sometimes bloodied, was viewed as both essential and vaguely improper. The 13th century French fabliaux, short comedic verse tales, featured washerwomen as comic figures, mischievous, flirtatious, street-smart. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the wife of Bath is not a washerwoman, but her loud, earthy personality resembles how many imagined the women who scrubbed the clothes of others, bold, unfiltered, worldly. There was, of course, class snobbery wrapped up in all this. Noble women employed laundresses, but rarely spoke of them. City records show detailed payments for the girl who washed the shifts, yet seldom record her name, and when things went wrong, when garments disappeared, or came back shrunk, or arrived late for a feast, the laundress could quickly become the scapegoat. Court records offer glimpses into just how high the stakes could be. In 1381, a washerwoman named Joan Le Baker in London was brought before the city court for allegedly misplacing a lady's velvet girdle, a rare and valuable belt. Joan insisted she had never received the girdle. The lady claimed otherwise. With no witnesses and no means of compensation, Joan was fined and forbidden from taking further clients without a male guarantor. In another case from York, a laundress was accused not of theft but of witchcraft. A nobleman had fallen ill, and suspicion fell upon his underclothes, cleaned just days before by a woman with a crooked eye and a birthmark on her hand. The case didn't proceed, but the damage was done. The laundress fled the town. These were not isolated events. The laundry maid existed in a delicate position. She entered private homes, handled private things, and then returned to the marketplace. She moved between worlds, and that mobility alone was enough to spark mistrust. It's no surprise that many towns developed regulations. Laundresses had to be licensed, work in designated areas, and were sometimes forbidden from cleaning men's garments without supervision. Still, most of them endured. They formed quiet networks, helping one another source better ash, share soap recipes, or pass along clients. In larger cities like Paris and Bruges, washerwomen formed informal guilds or associations, pooling resources to afford better equipment, and in rare cases, one might rise slightly in social standing, becoming the favoured laundress of a noble household, or marrying a craftsman and leaving the profession behind. There's a folk tale, likely apocryphal, told in different versions across France and Flanders. It tells of a young washerwoman who cleans a knight's bloodied tunic after battle. She stitches the tear, bleaches the stain, and returns it with a sprig of lavender, tied to the sleeve. The knight, moved by the care, seeks her out. They marry, and she becomes the lady of the manor. It's a tidy story, of course. Romanticised, idealised. But the fact that such a tale even circulated suggests that the image of the laundress, lowly but worthy, held a certain cultural weight. And then there were the accidents. A dropped tunic carried downstream. A nobleman's shirt shrunk from too much heat. A miscommunication about silk versus linen. Each could lead to lost wages, public embarrassment, or worse. In some towns, there were even designated laundry courts to settle disputes between clients and washerwomen. One curious note from a 15th century London ledger tells of a laundress fined for drying garments in a churchyard. The record reads, "For hanging hose upon the chapel gate, whereby the Lord's house was profaned and seen indecently adorned." Even drying could be controversial. Yet, despite all this, despite the dangers, the drudgery, the distrust, laundresses persisted. They persisted because someone had to, because people continued to stain their collars, spill their wine, and sweat through their bodices, and because for every noble who cared about status, there was a washerwoman who knew that vinegar water could lift a red wine stain, and that crushed ivy leaves could brighten a yellowed cuff. By the end of a life like Agnes's, there would be no portrait, no stone, perhaps not even a marked grave, but she would have left behind something else: decades of clean sheets, folded shifts, and garments that allowed others to present themselves to the world. Invisible work, essential work. So the next time you fold a shirt or scrub a stubborn stain, think of Agnes. Think of her standing at the river's edge, wind in her ears, soap burning her hands, humming under her breath, not changing history with great speeches or battles, but holding it together, seam by seam, one piece of laundry at a time. You are standing on the edge of the Nile, in the heat-soaked calm of the 14th century BCE. Papyrus rustles. Distant drums echo across the river. In the shimmering distance you can see the great pillars of Thebes rising toward the sun. Symbols of power, tradition, and divine order. Egypt is stable. The gods are many. Life is rhythmic, familiar, eternal. And then along comes Akhenaten. Long before anyone called him strange, heretical, or dangerous, he was just a prince. His name was Amenhotep IV. He was born into one of the wealthiest, most stable dynasties Egypt had ever known, the 18th dynasty. His father, Amenhotep III, was a builder, a diplomat, and a man so devoted to divine protocol that temples expanded under his reign like carefully tended vines. No one expected his son to challenge it all, not right away. When young Amenhotep was growing up in the royal palace, he was surrounded by statues, incense, prayers, and order. The priests of Amun, the dominant god of the time, were practically a second government. Their wealth rivaled that of the crown. Their temples stretched across the kingdom. Their rituals were layered with symbolism so dense that only a few could understand it. To be pharaoh was to inherit this machinery. The gods would whisper, the priests would interpret, the king would obey. But Amenhotep IV would hear only one god. Let's slow down for a moment. Imagine him as a teenager, thin-limbed, thoughtful, slightly distant. Perhaps he stood at the palace balcony, watching the sun rise over Karnak, his fingers tracing symbols in the dust, where others saw a pantheon of gods: hawk-headed Horus, ibis-faced Thoth, lion-bodied Sekhmet. He saw only the light, the disk, the sun itself. What would it mean, he wondered, if the sun alone were divine? This wasn't entirely unheard of. The sun god Ra had long been part of Egypt's religious fabric, and Aten, the visible sun disk, was known too, though usually as an aspect of other gods. But what Amenhotep began to imagine was different. A god with no face, no myth, no story, just light, energy, order, warmth, the source of life without the baggage of theology. At first this belief stayed quiet. When Amenhotep IV took the throne, likely still in his teens, he maintained the expected rituals. He wore the crowns, performed sacrifices, built monuments. He married Nefertiti, a noblewoman of sharp cheekbones and sharper political instincts. Together, they were painted in the typical style: stiff poses, blank expressions, eternal symbols. But something shifted. We see it in the art first. Suddenly, images of the royal couple show them not as stoic statues, but in motion, touching, laughing, playing with their daughters. Their bodies are elongated, almost rubbery. Akhenaten is drawn with wide hips, a protruding belly, and a long, narrow face. It's been debated for centuries whether this was stylized, medical, symbolic, or simply different. Then came the names. Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning effective for the Aten, a subtle shift. Not exactly. It was a bold rejection of Amun, the dominant deity. It would be like a medieval king renaming himself servant of the sunlight and refusing to acknowledge the church. And he didn't stop there. Akhenaten ordered the construction of a new capital, Akhetaten, horizon of the Aten. It was built from scratch in a remote stretch of desert, far from the influence of the traditional temples. He uprooted his court, his officials and his family, abandoning Thebes. Everything, architecture, ceremony, language, had to be rewritten around this one deity, Aten. At its heart, Akhenaten's revolution was theological. He believed the Aten alone deserved worship. No intermediaries, no animal-headed statues, just the sun disk, whose rays often end in tiny hands in temple art, touching faces, offering ankhs, caressing the king and queen like a parent with children. It sounds peaceful, even elegant. But it wasn't just a new religion, it was a dismantling of the old one. Temples to other gods were closed or defunded. Inscriptions were chiseled out. The names of gods were erased, sometimes violently. The priesthood of Amun, once rich and powerful, found itself silenced, its members cut off from influence. This wasn't a slow reform, it was a rupture. And here's where the story becomes strange. Because Akhenaten didn't stop with theology, his vision seeped into every part of life. Daily rituals changed, artistic conventions broke apart, even language evolved, inscriptions became more naturalistic, less formulaic. The entire structure of Egyptian daily life, built over centuries, was flipped. The old gods, those who oversaw birth, agriculture, love, death, were gone, and in their place a burning disk in the sky, and one man who claimed to understand it. Akhenaten's rule became a bubble, a beautifully decorated, eerily silent bubble. In the reliefs and carvings from Akhetaten, we see a world unlike any other in Egyptian art. Royal daughters sit on their father's lap. The queen kisses her child. The sun disk hovers above all, its rays blessing the royal family and no one else. Common people vanish from the narrative. There are no stories of soldiers, farmers or scribes in these temples. Only Akhenaten, Nefertiti and their daughters, bathed in light, isolated in symbolism. It's as if he imagined a kingdom made only of gods and royalty, with nothing in between. And all the while, beyond the desert walls of Akhetaten, Egypt continued. Priests seethed. Nobles waited. The people, unsure whether their gods had abandoned them or been abandoned by their king, murmured in taverns and marketplaces. This raises an important question. Did Akhenaten believe his own revolution? Was he a visionary, spiritually awakened? Or was this a political strategy, a way to break the back of the priesthood and consolidate power? In the next section, we'll explore what happened as his reign matured. We'll look at the growing isolation of his court, the fading presence of Nefertiti, and the pressures internal and external that began to close in. We'll follow the strange twilight of Akhetaten and what followed after the sun set on Egypt's weirdest pharaoh. By the 10th year of Akhetaten's reign, the city of Akhetaten had grown into a shimmering shell of ambition. It rose out of the desert like a mirage, rows of sunlit courtyards, whitewashed temples, sprawling palaces with columned halls open to the sky. From above it looked like an offering itself, a sacred canvas laid flat for the Aten to bless. And yet, the silence was deafening. What had begun as a theological revolution was now a kind of quiet autocracy. The Aten reigned above all, invisible and wordless, and Akhenaten, his earthly representative, stood between the divine and the people. No priests interceded, no mythologies comforted, no grand epics told of Aten's adventures. Just sunlight, unwavering, unquestioned. Within this strange serenity, the royal family became increasingly the center of everything. You might think of a pharaoh's palace as teeming with servants, advisors, soldiers. But here, in Akhetaten, the imagery focuses almost entirely on Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and their 6 daughters. The royal family became icons in the literal sense, flat, idealized, ever bathed in the rays of Aten. Their faces appear everywhere, etched into tomb walls, carved into pillars, immortalized in soft limestone reliefs. And yet, if you look closely, you'll notice something strange. Over time, the images of Nefertiti begin to fade. Not in the literal sense. Her bust, found centuries later, and now in Berlin, remains one of the most famous faces of the ancient world. But in the records, she stops appearing in inscriptions. Her titles, once grand and poetic, are used less frequently. Rumors, theories, and scholarly guesswork swirl in this vacuum. What happened to her? There are a few possibilities. She may have died, perhaps in childbirth. As was tragically common, she may have fallen out of favor, removed from the political center as Akhenaten became more reclusive. Or, as some have speculated, she may have taken on a new identity altogether, a co-ruler, even a pharaoh, under another name. There is evidence, thin but intriguing, that a figure named Nefertiti ruled alongside Akhenaten near the end of his life. Some suggest this was Nefertiti, ruling in male regalia under a throne name. Others argue it was one of their daughters. In either case, the power dynamics within the palace were shifting. The icon of maternal grace had either departed, transformed, or been hidden. Meanwhile, the city itself was starting to crack beneath the glare of Etan. While Akhenaten worshipped the sun disk and commissioned endless hymns praising its rays, the rest of Egypt began to suffer. Tomb inscriptions from other cities mention neglect, grain shortages, neglected temples, invasions along the borders. The Hittites were growing stronger to the north. Nubian unrest stirred to the south. Egypt's military, diplomatic, and spiritual defenses had all been hollowed out to feed one man's vision, and Akhenaten. He seemed to retreat further inward. He stopped attending diplomatic ceremonies. Traditional titles disappeared. The gods of old, Amun, Osiris, Isis, Hathor, were not merely ignored but actively erased, their names chiseled out from temple walls, their statues smashed, their festivals cancelled. This was not passive neglect. It was a surgical purge of an entire theological system. For ordinary Egyptians, this was deeply unsettling. Religion was not just belief, it was rhythm. The gods explained the floods, the crops, the mysteries of birth and death. To remove them was to unweave the very fabric of daily life. While the sun still rose, the meaning beneath it dimmed. And in the royal city, the people waited for rain, for blessings, for sense. Within the palace, Akhenaten's world grew even stranger. He increasingly depicted himself in divine form, worshipping himself as he worshipped the Akhenaten. His daughters were shown in poses typically reserved for deities, their heads tilted toward the sun, their fingers outstretched to receive its rays. The royal family became not just rulers, but the only visible conduits to the divine. But gods, even solar ones, require infrastructure, and outside Akhetaten, the infrastructure of empire was beginning to collapse. Records show that provincial governors grew restless. Some maintained secret worship of banned gods. Others began to reassert traditional titles. The priesthood, though scattered, remained quietly alive, waiting for the winds to shift. Akhenaten either didn't notice or didn't care. His writings in these final years remain poetic, obsessive. The great hymn to the Aten, likely composed by or for Akhenaten, describes the sun disk as the source of all life, the father of all creation, the singular light that reveals the world. It is beautiful. It is also isolating, for in this world, only the pharaoh sees clearly. The rest must stand in shadow. And then, one day, the sun began to set. Akhenaten died, around 1336 BCE. We don't know how. No fanfare, no national mourning has been recorded. His death, like his reign, was shrouded in silence. The succession was unclear. A young boy, Tutankhaten, would soon take the throne. He would change his name to Tutankhamun. He would restore the old gods. He would abandon Akhetaten. And slowly, the entire memory of Akhetaten would be erased. His name was struck from king lists. His monuments were dismantled. His city crumbled into the sand. The god he had championed, the Aten, was no longer worshipped. It was as if he had never existed. But we know he did, and in our final section, we will explore his legacy, not in temples or tombs, but in the strange echoes of his reign, the art he inspired, the theology he challenged, and the question that has haunted Egyptologists ever since. Was Akhenaten a madman, or the first monotheist in history? When Akhenaten died, he left behind a sunlit city full of silence, broken traditions and unfinished prayers. His body was never found, at least not with certainty. His tomb, carved in the cliffs east of Akhenaten, was never completed. No grand procession, no golden sarcophagus, no solemn priests chanting the old rites. Just sand, sun, and erasure. What followed was one of the most thorough purges in ancient history, not of a regime, but of memory itself. The Egyptians had a name for this: damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. To be erased from the afterlife was to suffer the ultimate fate. Your name scratched from stone, your statues shattered, your images defaced. This wasn't just political revenge, it was spiritual annihilation. In the Egyptian worldview, to live forever, one needed to be remembered. Akhenaten was not. His successors moved quickly. Tutankhaten, likely his son or stepson, was placed on the throne as a child. His advisors, practical men trained in the old religion, changed his name to Tutankhamun, living image of Amun, a pointed reversal. The capital was returned to Thebes. The temples of the Aten were closed or converted. Priests of Amun re-emerged. And over time, Akhenaten's name was systematically chiseled from monuments, erased from king lists, and scrubbed from public consciousness. Akhenaten, the shining city in the desert, was abandoned. Its temples collapsed. The sands reclaimed it. For nearly 3,000 years, no one spoke his name. It wasn't until the 19th century that Akhenaten returned. First as a puzzle, then as an obsession. Archaeologists digging near modern-day Amarna found odd, almost comical statues, elongated figures with soft bellies and wide hips, posed beneath radiant sun discs. It didn't look like any other Egyptian art. For a long time they thought it was a mistake, or a provincial cult. Then the inscriptions were translated. Akhenaten, Nefertiti, a family lost to history, suddenly emerging with strange stories, stranger art, and an even stranger ideology. The scholarly world was fascinated and divided. Who was this man? To some, he was the first true monotheist, long before Moses, before Zoroaster, before the rise of Islam or Christianity. Akhenaten proclaimed one god and one god only, the Aten, a universal, faceless force, benevolent, all-powerful, and omnipresent. No statues, no intermediaries, just sunlight. This idea resonated. Sigmund Freud even proposed that Moses had been an Egyptian priest of Aten, who fled persecution and reintroduced monotheism elsewhere. Others saw Akhenaten as a tragic idealist, a philosopher king who tried to uplift the masses and failed. Still others viewed him as a delusional egomaniac, who centralized power by destroying traditional religion. Modern evidence suggests a little of everything. Akhenaten's reforms were sincere, but also politically useful. His isolation may have been spiritual, but it also protected his rule from dissent. His artistic revolution celebrated family life and emotion, but erased almost everyone outside the royal household. His theology was intellectually advanced, but disconnected from the agricultural, funerary, and moral needs of most Egyptians. And yet his fingerprints are everywhere. He pioneered a style of art that broke convention. Naturalistic, vulnerable, human, he emphasized the family in royal iconography, like no pharaoh before him. He placed the sun, not myth, at the center of his world. Even after his death and his erasure, something about his vision lingered. You can feel it in later heresies, in mystical sun cults, in whispers of divine unity. You can see it in the unique curve of the bust of Nefertiti. You can hear it in the silence between the lines of scripture. The moment when someone, somewhere, once said, "What if there is only one?" But perhaps the most haunting part of Akhenaten's legacy isn't the religion he created, it's the way history handled him. How thoroughly, how completely, and how deliberately he was wiped away, not as a warning, but as an inconvenience. He didn't just vanish, He was made to vanish, which makes you wonder how many others did the same. How many revolutions, quiet and sunlit, bloomed for a moment and were then buried by the weight of the familiar. Akhenaten's city lies in ruins now. His monuments crumble. His sun god no longer rises in prayer. But for a brief moment, in the middle of a long and myth-filled history, one man looked up at the sky and saw not many gods but one. And that, in its own quiet way, changed everything, even if no one noticed until centuries later. Imagine walking through the highlands of the Andes, just as dawn begins to lift the chill off the mountain air. The light spreads slowly across terraces carved into the hillsides like giant green staircases. In the distance, you hear the soft rustle of wind through quinoa stalks, the clink of stone tools, and somewhere, faint laughter as a farmer turns over the soil, and nestled among it all, not potatoes, not corn, but something else. A small tree, humble, shrubby. Its branches hang heavy with fruit you've likely never seen. Maybe you've never even heard of them. Welcome to the overlooked orchards of the Inca Empire, where the people didn't just build roads, temples, and a sophisticated bureaucracy, but also carefully domesticated an astonishing range of plants. Among them, a set of fruits so modest, so local, so quietly powerful, that most of them never left the continent, but they fed an empire. When we think of Inca agriculture, the staples come to mind first. Potatoes, of course, over 3,000 varieties, and maize, which was elevated to sacred status. But this only scratches the surface of what was grown. Hidden within the valleys, the cloud forests, and the subtropical fringe of the empire were dozens of fruit species, cultivated not for trade, not even necessarily for surplus, but for taste, health, and sacred ritual. Let's begin with a fruit you've probably never tasted: lucuma. Lucuma is often called the gold of the Incas. On the outside, it looks like a green avocado, but inside, a sunset-colored flesh that tastes like sweet potato crossed with maple syrup. It grows high in the Andes and was so treasured that images of the fruit appear in ancient ceramics. The Incas used it not just as food, but as medicine, believed to promote fertility and longevity. Today, it's still popular in parts of Peru, mostly in desserts. But globally, it remains obscure, overshadowed by more marketable fruits. Then there's cherimoya, dubbed by Mark Twain as the most delicious fruit known to man. Its outer skin is leathery and knobby, but inside, soft white flesh, creamy and fragrant. Its nickname is fitting: custard apple. The Incas grew it at elevations that would surprise modern horticulturists, leveraging microclimates across the mountain slopes to their advantage. And that's key to understanding how the Incas were able to cultivate so many kinds of fruit. Their empire stretched from sea level to over 13,000 feet. In that range, dozens of microclimates bloomed, some misty and cool, others hot and dry. The Incas didn't fight the land, they adapted to it. They built vertical archipelagos, a term anthropologists use to describe the way they spread crops across altitudes like layers in a climate sandwich. Lowlands grew cotton and peppers. Highlines yielded tubers. The mid-elevations, the fruit belt, grew things the modern supermarket barely remembers. Take kotum, a tomato-like fruit with a tangy citrus flavor. It was grown not for export or market, but for sauces and stews, sour and spicy mixes that filled the highland air with rich aroma. Or naranjia, with its hairy skin and bright green pulp, used in fermented drinks and occasional sacrifices to the gods of rain. But the domestication process itself was no accident. These were not wild fruits plucked randomly. The Inca and the cultures before them selected, bred, and cared for these plants for generations. Seeds were passed through families like heirlooms. Some crops were grown on dedicated terraces, others in experimental gardens near the great city of Cusco. These plots weren't for food, they were for observation. The empire was literally testing which plants thrived at what altitude, in which soil, under which seasonal patterns. In a way, it was scientific agriculture, centuries before the scientific method had a name. Yet perhaps the most poignant example of forgotten fruit is the pepino dulce, or sweet cucumber. It looks like a purple-streaked melon, the size of a child's fist. Light, juicy, fragrant like cantaloupe. The Inca prized it not only for its taste but also its symbolism, used in fertility rituals, often depicted in textiles as a token of abundance. It didn't store well, didn't ship well, and thus never made it into European trade. So like so many of these plants, it remained local, tucked into valleys where the sun hits just right for a few hours each afternoon. You might be wondering if these fruits were so special, so carefully cultivated, why were they forgotten? Part of the answer lies in conquest. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they didn't just bring steel and horses, they brought a new agricultural logic, one that prioritized high-yield crops, market value, and transatlantic survivability. Apples, grapes, wheat, the local, the delicate, the specific. These were swept aside in favor of the global and the profitable. Lucuma was replaced with sugar, cherimoya with citrus, cocona with onions and garlic. But some of these fruits survived, in quiet gardens, on steep terraces only locals visit, passed down not in books but in habit, like the old man in Chachapoyas who still slices open naranjilla for juice every morning, or the women in the Sacred Valley who plant pepino dulce for their grandchildren, not because it's profitable but because it's what their own grandmothers did. These fruits never built temples, they never crowned kings, but they kept communities alive, and there's something quietly miraculous about that. In the next section, we'll explore how these fruits were used, not just in meals but in rituals, medicines and daily social life. We'll step into kitchens, ceremonies and market stalls, and follow the rhythm of the Inca year as it revolved around planting, harvest, and sacred celebration. Picture a small Andean village just before dawn. A young girl stands barefoot outside her family's thatched home, cupping a halved lucuma fruit in her hands. She dips her fingers into its golden flesh and places a smear on the worn stone beside the doorway, a quiet offering to Pachamama, the Earth Mother. Her grandmother watches silently, nodding. It's not a big ceremony, not even something most would notice, but it's part of the rhythm, a small sticky ritual passed down like seed. This is how fruit lived in the Inca world, not just as food but as a bridge between the body and spirit, between humans and gods, between one season and the next. We begin with medicine. The Inca Empire was vast, over 2,500 miles from north to south, and within its borders lived dozens of ethnic groups, each with their own traditions of healing. Yet a shared thread ran through many of them, the idea that fruits like herbs could balance the body, not just sweet indulgences, but tonics for heat, for chill, for fatigue, for fertility. Take naranjilla, for instance. This small, citrusy fruit, bright green inside and covered with tiny hairs, was often crushed into a pulp and applied to the skin to treat sunburn or irritation. Drunk as a juice, it was thought to cleanse the body, helpful during seasonal transitions, especially before long journeys or communal fasts. Cherimoya, rich in natural sugars and fiber, was used to calm upset stomachs. The seeds, though toxic if consumed in quantity, were powdered and rubbed into the scalp to treat lice. Fruit and tree, root and leaf, nothing was wasted. Coconut, sour and slightly peppery, played a role in fevers. Mixed with chicha, a lightly fermented maize drink, it became part of a folk remedy for respiratory illness. Healers believed its sharp flavor could cut through blocked humors in the chest. Then there's lucuma, the golden-fleshed treasure of the highlands. It was believed to strengthen the blood. Women consumed it postpartum to regain energy. Children were given it to help them sleep. Mixed with hot water and a pinch of ash or crushed herbs, it became a tonic for melancholy, what we might call depression today, though they would have described it as a heaviness of the heart. These aren't just isolated anecdotes. Archaeologists have uncovered mortars with fruit pulp residue, healing bundles wrapped in leaves, and even small ceramic vessels shaped like the fruits themselves, tools of both treatment and symbol. But fruit's role didn't end at the sickbed. It sat at the heart of Incan ritual life. The Inca calendar was marked by agricultural festivals, each one tied to phases of planting, harvest, and seasonal change. Offerings to the gods called kapasoka were made not just with silver or animal sacrifice, but with baskets of fruit, ripe, unblemished, perfectly shaped. They were laid at mountaintops, buried near springs, or burned in fires meant to carry their scent to the gods. In the Inti Raymi festival held in honor of the sun god Inti, local lords brought food gifts to Cusco, including dried fruits from the lowlands, molo berries, guava, and passi. A pod fruit similar to vanilla-flavored cotton candy were presented to the Sapa Inca and his priests, not just as snacks but as symbolic foods. Their sweetness was a metaphor for divine favor. Fruits also featured in more intimate rites. At weddings, couples might share a split pepino dulce to symbolize fertility and cooperation. Its soft flesh and delicate flavor served as a reminder. Sweetness only lasts if tended with care. In funerary rituals, certain fruits were buried alongside the dead, especially those from faraway regions. It was believed that the deceased, on their journey into the next life, would need reminders of where they came from. Dried lucuma slices, seeds of cherimoya, or the distinctive shell of the camu camu fruit served as tokens of identity, a fruit from your homeland, a snack for the afterlife. Even in politics, fruit played its part. Diplomatic gifts between regions often included regional fruit. A noble from the eastern forests might bring baskets of aguaje, a fruit grown in swampy lowlands, rich in beta-carotene and oil. It was exotic, difficult to transport, and thus a mark of effort. Like sending a box of cherries in winter today, it signaled wealth, connection, and a bit of awe. And then there's daily life. You might think of Inca society as rigid, formal, golden temples and strict hierarchies, but between the rituals and the rulers was the hum of ordinary life. Markets, kitchens, quiet hunger. Fruit was woven into the fabric of it all. In Cusco's markets, vendors sold sun-dried cherimoya and pickled cocona. In rural homes, children sucked the pulp from sacha tomate, a wild Andean fruit, while elders mended fishing nets. Fruit was preserved for winter, traded for cloth, used to flavor chicha or to mask the bitterness of medicinal herbs. And most importantly, it brought pleasure. That part often gets left out in historical accounts. The idea that people in the past enjoyed flavor, texture, sweetness, that a grandmother might hide the last lucuma to mash into a warm cake on a feast day, that a child might sneak pacai pods into their blanket, licking the sugary fluff before falling asleep. Pleasure isn't always recorded in clay or stone, but it lingers in oral history, in folk memory, in quiet gardens. As the sun sets on the Andes, even now you can find these fruits still growing, though fewer than before, cultivated by hands that don't think of themselves as preserving history, just as doing what needs to be done. Which raises a final question. In the next section, we'll explore the disappearance, how colonial agriculture, shifting diets, and modern logistics caused many of these fruits to vanish from global view. We'll follow their seeds through time, trace efforts to revive them, and ask what it means when the tastes of an empire fade into forgotten orchards. Centuries pass, the stones of Cusco remain, but their names change. The sun temples are cloaked in churches, Quechua is whispered instead of sung, and in the high terraces where lucuma once ripened in baskets of sun, other things begin to grow: barley, apples, wheat, fruits from far-off lands, fruits that shipped well. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire was not just a political collapse, it was an agricultural revolution, and not one of progress, but of replacement. Let's pause here and trace the path of one forgotten fruit, the pepino dulce. As Spanish colonists moved into the highland valleys, they brought with them a toolkit of European crops: grapevines, olive trees, fig saplings, even almond cuttings. These were planted in the same soil where pepino once thrived. But the pepino didn't fit the colonial imagination. It didn't ferment like grapes, it didn't cure like olives, and it didn't command a European palate. Too watery, too fragile, too mild. So the pepino was left behind. Other fruits faced the same fate. Coconut, with its sharp citrus bite, didn't appeal to European tastes accustomed to the softer sweetness of oranges and apples. Lucuma, dense and starchy, lacked the bright, juicy pop preferred in colonial desserts. Even cherimoya, which some adored, was deemed too finicky for trade, bruising easily, resisting storage, and turning brown within hours. Agricultural priorities shifted. Spanish authorities seized farmland, dismantled Incan terrace systems, and turned once diverse orchards into monocultures, single crop fields designed for export and tax. Sugarcane, grapes, tobacco. Over time, the vertical archipelagos of microclimates, the genius of Incan adaptation, gave way to flatter thinking. What sells? What travels? And just like that, the orchard became quiet, but not extinct. In isolated regions, especially in the cloud forests and deep Andean valleys, the old fruits survived, protected not by policy, but by remoteness. Villages without roads still planted cherimoya beside their kitchens. Families in chachapoyas still used naranchilla in morning stews. In the eastern lowlands, Aguashi palms still dropped orange-skinned fruit into the swampy floor, where they were gathered by hand and sold in tiny bundles. In these corners of the Andes, the fruits lived on in folk recipes, market stalls and children's games, but not in history books. Then came the scientists. In the mid-20th century, a wave of botanists and agricultural historians began studying lost crops of the Incas. Some were driven by curiosity, others by global hunger. What if these forgotten plants could feed modern populations? What if lucuma, rich in fiber and slow sugars, could become a health food? What if camu camu, bursting with vitamin C, could rival the orange? Some of these dreams came true. Sort of. In the 1990s, lucuma powder began showing up in natural food stores in the United States. Touted as a superfood, camu camu became a boutique supplement in capsule form. Even cherimoya found its way into California farmers' markets, rebranded as custard apple, its exoticness gently scrubbed away. But here's the quiet irony. The fruits that once nourished an empire came back as novelties. They were no longer central, no longer sacred. They became additives, flavors, curiosities in smoothies, forgotten in the very places where they had once been tended by hand, protected by climate, and offered to gods. Still, some resisted commodification. In certain Quechua communities, for example, pepino dulce is still passed from mother to daughter, not for market but for love. A grandmother plants a vine not to sell, but because it grew beside her own childhood home. A boy in the Sacred Valley bites into a lucuma, not because of antioxidants, but because it's what's ripe. There are also quiet movements of revival, not corporate but cultural. Andean agricultural cooperatives have begun mapping old orchards. Ethnobotanists are working with elders to document recipes, planting patterns, even lullabies that mention fruit. In some schools, children now learn the Quechua words for each crop, not just the names, but the stories, because that's what fruit carried in Inca society. Stories, the naranjia that glowed like a miniature sun, the pacay that foamed like clouds, the lucuma, whose slow ripening matched the rhythms of morning. Each fruit marked a season, a ritual, a reminder that flavor isn't frivolous, it's memory, metabolized. As we conclude this story, let us stand once more in that early morning light of the Andes. Let us place a slice of cherimoya on the tongue, not as a trend, but as a time machine. It tastes soft, clean, a little floral, like something just remembered, because sometimes history isn't made by kings or battles. Sometimes it's tucked inside a fruit no one exported, one that still grows quietly in a garden halfway up a hill, waiting to be remembered, not for what it's worth, but for what it meant. You wake up in 1861, the air is thick with London fog, the gaslights hiss quietly. Somewhere in the distance a carriage rattles over wet cobblestones, and in the window of nearly every shop, from hatmaker to grocer, you see black, not just fabric, not just fashion, black as a declaration, black as identity, black as duty. Because Queen Victoria is mourning, and she will be, for the rest of her life. This is the story of how one woman's personal grief transformed an empire's social rituals, reshaped global textile industries, and turned the colour black into something far more powerful than absence. It became a code, a soft, silent language that governed how people dressed, how they behaved, even how they moved through the world. But to understand why mourning clothes mattered so much, we have to go back not to 1861, but to a love story. Victoria and Albert married in 1840. It was not a typical royal arrangement. While most royal unions were more strategic than sentimental, Victoria was, by all accounts, deeply, entirely, and sometimes awkwardly in love with her husband. She described him in her diaries with unrestrained passion, so handsome, so full of grace. I never spent such an evening. They had 9 children. He helped her govern, modernize the court, and introduced reforms in everything from art to plumbing. Their partnership was political, personal, and unusually tender. Then, in December of 1861, Prince Albert died of what was then called typhoid fever. Though some now suspect it may have been cancer or Crohn's disease, he was just 42. Victoria was shattered, and from that moment forward, she never wore colour again. She withdrew from public life, retreated to her estates, and dressed only in deep black mourning garments. For decades, not for weeks or months as etiquette might have required, but for over 40 years. At first, this was personal grief, but as monarch, her choices carried weight. Her wardrobe became the empire's, her mourning became law, and soon all of British society, especially its women, began to follow her into a world of strict, codified, emotionally symbolic fashion. Let's take a closer look at these rules. Victorian mourning clothes weren't just black dresses. They were a highly structured set of garments dictated by mourning etiquette guides, fashion magazines, and social norms. The first stage of mourning, or deep mourning, lasted 1 full year and 1 day. During this time, women wore dull black bombazine, a stiff, lifeless fabric made of silk and wool. No sheen, no ornamentation. Jewellery was forbidden, except perhaps for jet, a fossilized black tree resin carved into brooches or lockets. Gloves and veils were black. Hats were modest. Even the sewing thread used was black. The second stage, or half mourning, allowed for a touch of ornament, perhaps a lace collar or fabrics with texture like crepe. After 6 months, secondary mourning permitted some minor colour, lilac, grey, or deep purple tones, seen as muted enough to reflect dignity without joy. Altogether, a proper mourning period for a widow could last 2.5 years, and if she were mourning someone close, a parent, sibling or child, more time could be added. The mourning clock reset with each new death. Men's mourning, by contrast, was far simpler. A black suit, a black armband, a cravat, sometimes just a black ribbon pinned discreetly. Their mourning lasted weeks, not years. It was women who bore the burden of public grief. Through dress, gesture, and ritual, their very appearance became a living shrine to the dead. And these expectations were not just cultural, they were enforced by society. In polite circles, wearing inappropriate colours after a death could lead to ostracism. A widow who reappeared in pale blue too soon might be deemed cold or frivolous. On the other hand, one who wore black too long could be mocked as maudlin or socially out of step. It was a delicate dance, governed by unspoken timetables and emotional arithmetic. Victoria, however, ignored all of it. She wore black until her death in 1901, 40 years after Albert's. Even her undergarments were black. She commissioned mourning dresses embroidered with his initials. She slept beside a plaster cast of his hand. When she travelled, she brought his shaving kit. His room in Windsor Castle remained untouched. This wasn't just mourning, it was devotion through costume, and it left a powerful imprint on Victorian culture. Mourning clothes became an industry. Textile mills shifted production to black dyes. Mourning shops sprang up in London, Paris, Boston. There were entire departments within stores like Harrods devoted to mourning wear. Some families kept a wardrobe of mourning garments ready in anticipation of death. Grief had a supply chain. It also had contradictions. For the working poor, these rules were impossible. Who could afford 3 stages of black clothing? Who had time to mourn when wages stopped? Many families had just one dark dress, rotated between members. In some cases, neighbours would lend garments to help someone appear appropriately grief-stricken at a funeral. And yet, even among the poor, the pressure to conform remained, because to fail at mourning clothes was not just a fashion faux pas, it was seen as moral failure. This is the strange alchemy Victoria created. Grief became visible, social, regulated, and in doing so deeply personal mourning became part of the machinery of empire. In the next section, we'll explore how this obsession spread into art, photography, and even science. We'll look at mourning jewellery made from human hair, death portraits, and the global ripple effects of British mourning culture from India to the Caribbean. We'll also trace how black itself came to represent not only grief but respectability, discipline, and moral uprightness, all because one woman never stopped wearing it. Imagine sitting for a portrait with your dead child. You wear your best black silk dress. Your hair is pinned precisely. A lace veil shadows your face. In your arms, the child's body wrapped, quiet, still warm enough to cradle. The photographer says nothing. Exposure time, several seconds. No one moves. This was not macabre. It was considered loving, proper, respectful. This was Victorian mourning in its second phase. Not just about clothing, but about capturing loss, shaping grief into ritual, art, and object. In the decades following Prince Albert's death, Queen Victoria's mourning habits filtered into every corner of life. For those in her orbit, Mourning wasn't just a response to loss, it was a style of life, a structure, and in many cases, an obligation. Let's begin with the jewellery. Mourning jewellery became a widespread custom in the second half of the 19th century. These were not sparkling gems or showpieces of wealth. They were soft, symbolic, sometimes unsettling. Most common were pieces made from jet, a black fossilised wood found near Whitby in northern England. Jet had been used since Roman times, but Queen Victoria's preference for it after Albert's death triggered a jet boom. Entire workshops in Whitby specialised in carving brooches, rings, bracelets and lockets. Designs featured common mourning symbols, weeping willows, urns, clasped hands, angels, even tiny enamel portraits of the deceased. But more intimate still were the pieces made of human hair. Yes, real hair. Often from the deceased, though not always. It could be braided, woven, or curled under crystal glass. Rings bore loops of baby curls. Necklaces were formed from intricately plaited strands. For widows, wearing a lock of their husband's hair against the skin was a gesture of both devotion and continuity, as if a part of the person still lived. It may sound strange today, but in a time before photography was widespread, a strand of hair was among the few permanent remnants of a loved one. Hair does not decay. It could be touched, held, passed down, and so it became memory in material form. Photography, when it did arrive, added another layer. Post-mortem photography, also known as mourning portraits, flourished between the 1850s and 1880s. These images weren't hidden or taboo. They were displayed in homes, often placed alongside wedding photos or portraits of living relatives. There were different styles. Some showed the deceased lying peacefully, posed as if asleep. Others showed the body upright, eyes painted onto closed lids, dressed in life's finest clothes, surrounded by flowers or family. This wasn't considered morbid. It was simply part of the long goodbye, because in Victorian England, death was a slow exit. There were wakes, visits, viewings. There were mourning letters, printed death cards, newspaper announcements. There were mourning cakes, mourning gloves, mourning tea services. And there was long stretches of it, spent waiting for grief to soften. This entire culture flowed outward from Victoria's court, carried across oceans on ships and in suitcases. Mourning rituals accompanied British colonial administrators to India, Australia, Africa, and the Caribbean, missionaries dressed in black in tropical climates. Despite the heat, mourning portraits were taken in Calcutta, Cape Town, and Kingston. In some places, local customs blended with British forms. In Trinidad, for example, enslaved and later freed African-descended families adopted black mourning garb, but combined it with ancestral singing traditions. In India, some upper-class families held hybrid funerals, Hindu ceremonies conducted by day, with formal British mourning garments worn at night for visiting colonial dignitaries. In short, the aesthetic of grief became global, and with it, a new idea began to take hold, that to mourn correctly was not just an act of personal emotion, but a public performance of moral character. To wear black was to be respectable. To grieve in stages, visibly, formally, patiently, was to be civilized. But this led to tension. What if you didn't feel like grieving that way? What if your sorrow was too loud or too quiet? What if you were a poor widow with no access to crepe? What if you remarried too soon? The mourning system became both a refuge and a trap. It gave structure to chaos, but also rules to something that had once been private. For Queen Victoria, the trap became a kind of comfort. As she aged, she remained draped in black layered veils, gloves, widow's caps, even in portraits, even in summer, even when political advisors begged her to rejoin the world in colour. Her grief became her brand, and in doing so, she gave birth to a new version of British femininity, modest, sombre, dignified, and disciplined. The grieving woman as moral compass, the widow as icon. This version of womanhood rippled through novels, sermons, etiquette books and magazines. It reinforced ideals of sacrifice, restraint and quiet endurance, values that British society increasingly prized, especially as the empire grew and sought to define its own moral superiority. But by the late 1890s, cracks began to form. Younger generations raised in a world saturated by mourning started to rebel. Writers mocked professional mourners. Fashion houses introduced brighter colours, even for widows. Some magazines published editorials questioning the psychological toll of prolonged mourning rituals. And yet Victoria did not bend. She died in 1901, at the age of 81. She was buried in a white gown, at her request, with a lock of Albert's hair and his dressing gown folded beside her. Even in death she mourned. In our final section, we'll explore what happened after her passing, how mourning culture changed in the 20th century, how black took on new meanings, and what remains today of an era when grief was measured not in therapy or time, but in stitches, veils, and the weight of a dress. On a cold January day in 1901, Queen Victoria was laid to rest. She had reigned for 63 years, longer than any monarch in British history up to that point, and she left behind not only an empire that spanned the globe, but a grief culture that had reshaped how death was experienced. Her mourning clothes had become a symbol, and now that symbol was gone, but mourning itself was not. The early 20th century saw a curious shift. As the century turned and modernity crept forward, motor cars, electric lights, telephones, the heavy rituals of Victorian grief began to feel outdated. But they didn't vanish overnight. They lingered, like perfume in an old coat. They softened. They adapted. Let's begin with the Edwardians. When Victoria's son Edward VII ascended the throne, he signalled a new tone. Less severe, more social. His court was lighter, more indulgent, less draped in memory. The country followed suit. Mourning rules relaxed. Widows still wore black, but often for shorter periods. Silk returned. Jewellery sparkled again, yet the ghost of Victorian mourning remained. Fashion magazines still printed mourning schedules. Department stores like Harrods still stocked mourning departments. Etiquette books advised how to navigate grief at the garden party, the opera, or a seaside retreat. And then World War I changed everything. The war killed millions, most of them young men. Grief became universal, uncontainable, and impossible to ritualize. You could no longer follow neat mourning timelines when your son's body was never recovered. Black creep couldn't cover what had happened in the trenches. And yet, people tried. Photographs from the 1910s and 1920s show entire families in black widows, mothers, sisters, daughters. But the tone had changed. The old Victorian order, where mourning was a slow, structured journey, began to unravel under the weight of mass death. What emerged was something both more private and more public. Private, in the sense that many began to internalize grief. Rather than wear strict mourning clothes, people wore mourning jewellery discreetly. A locket tucked into a blouse, a pin on the inside of a coat. Public, in the sense that war memorials, cenotaphs, plaques, parades became the new face of collective loss. The focus shifted from what you wore to where you remembered. By the 1920s, fashion had moved on. Flappers wore fringe, not veils. Mourning clothes were sometimes mocked in women's magazines as old-fashioned relics. The colour black began to shed its exclusive association with grief and became a symbol of modern elegance. Coco Chanel's famous little black dress, introduced in 1926, signalled not sorrow but sophistication. And yet, black never entirely lost its gravity. Throughout the 20th century, black remained the default colour for funerals across Europe and the Americas. Mourning dress had become less structured, but still expected, especially for widows, older women and certain faith communities. In Orthodox Jewish and Catholic traditions, black remained a sign of humility and reflection. In Britain, you could still find traces of Victoria's influence. Up until the 1950s, widows often wore half-mourning colours. Navy, grey, mauve, black hats and gloves were worn to funerals. Children were taught to speak in hushed tones around grieving adults. Photographs of the royal family, after funerals, especially of Queen Elizabeth II, often show muted attire, straight postures, gloved hands folded in solemnity. Even after Victoria's era ended, the aesthetic of composed grief endured, but it was also being questioned. In the post-war decades, psychology began to replace etiquette. Freud's theories of mourning and melancholia filtered into public discourse. Grief became internalized, less about appearance, more about process. Mourning clothes were no longer required. The black veil gave way to therapy. The mourning timetable gave way to open-ended healing. By the 1980s and 1990s, the only people who still followed strict mourning dress were usually over 70 or very wealthy. And yet, even today, Queen Victoria's legacy lingers. Think of the colour black at a funeral, the expectation that guests will dress appropriately, The continued popularity of mourning jewellery, now sold on Etsy as memorial keepsakes, the presence of black veils at royal funerals, most recently at the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II in 2022. All of this has roots in Victoria's wardrobe. Her personal grief became an institutional framework. Her clothing choices still echo in the way we think about how grief should look. And yet, her story also reminds us of something else. That mourning is not always logical, that it doesn't end when society says it should, that sometimes it takes shape in fabric, in jewellery, in ritual. Not because it has to, but because it helps. Victoria didn't wear black for the empire. She wore it because she couldn't imagine not wearing it, because Albert was gone and the world had changed, and no amount of empire could make it whole again. So she dressed the wound, layer by layer, stitch by stitch, until grief itself became a second skin. You are in a quiet courtyard. The bamboo rustles gently. There is no rush, no chatter, just the soft clink of porcelain, the swirl of steam from a clay kettle, and the sound of water being poured with deliberate care. You are not in a palace. You are not in a war camp. You are in a tea house, and yet you are at the very center of ancient Chinese culture, diplomacy, philosophy, and control. This is the story of tea, not as a drink, but as a ritual, a practice so layered, so precise, and so central to life in imperial China that even emperors paused for it. Behind the simplicity of hot water and leaves lies a story of power, patience, and the gentle performance of status. Let's begin, appropriately, with waiting. Tea drinking in early China did not begin with ceremony. It began with medicine. The earliest references to tea, or cha, as it came to be called, come from the Shenong Ben Sao Jing, a 3th century BCE pharmacological text. Tea leaves, boiled in water, were believed to purify the body, sharpen the mind, and ease digestion. It was bitter, strong, and often mixed with other herbs. But by the time of the Tang dynasty, 618–907 CE, something shifted. Tea began to be enjoyed, not only for its effects, but for its experience. Monks used it to stay awake during meditation. Scholars praised its calming properties. Poets compared it to stillness, to clarity, to the refinement of the soul. And so tea drinking began to evolve into tea practice. And eventually, tea ceremony. In Tang times, powdered tea was whipped into hot water using bamboo whisks. This technique, later borrowed by Japanese matcha traditions, was part of an increasingly aestheticized process. Every motion had meaning. The shape of the teapot, the temperature of the water, the angle of the wrist. Nothing was accidental. But it was under the Song dynasty, 960–1279 CE, that tea truly became an art form and a form of social performance. Imagine a gathering of scholar officials. They sit not in opulent halls but in private studies, surrounded by calligraphy scrolls, carved screens, and moon-shaped windows. They do not raise their voices. They do not toast or drink deeply. Instead, they prepare tea, very slowly, very quietly. Tea was ground to a fine powder on a stone mill. A servant, or in some cases the host himself, heated spring water to just below boiling. The water was poured into warmed bowls, often made of dark gineware, so that the green foam would be more striking. Bamboo whisks beat the surface to a frothy finish, and then they sipped, not to quench thirst but to observe. Texture, temperature, aroma, the feel of the bowl in the hand. Conversation followed, but never over tea. The tea was the conversation, a way of showing cultivation, self-control, and respect for tradition. In essence, the tea ceremony became a kind of social mirror. If you rushed it, you were crude. If your hands trembled, you were inexperienced. If you talked too much, you were vulgar. The ceremony revealed you, not by what you said, but by how you poured. It was also a form of soft power. Tea gatherings were used by officials and courtiers to signal allegiance, test rivals, or build quiet alliances. Invitations to tea were a mark of favour. The host chose the teas, the utensils, even the water source, all carefully selected to communicate something. For example, serving a rare tea from a distant mountain might suggest political reach. Using antique songware implied deep respect for tradition. Offering a bit of varietal could even be interpreted as a subtle critique, especially if paired with a poetic remark. Tea diplomacy, it was sometimes called, and emperors knew its power well. The Ming dynasty, 1368-1644 CE, saw further refinement. Loose-leaf tea replaced powdered tea. Teapots, especially those made from Yixing clay, became central. The act of brewing became more intimate, more internal. Where the Song tea practice was performative, Ming tea was meditative. It was during this time that the concept of gongfu tea, sometimes translated as tea with skill, emerged. Small clay teapots, tiny cups, multiple infusions. The goal was not to impress guests, but to submit yourself to the tea, to become precise, patient, present. But even here, status whispered through every step. How many times the leaves were steeped? What wood the water was boiled over? Whether you let your guests smell the leaves before or after warming the cup. It was a world of quiet signals, more refined than any jeweled ring or silk robe, and this precision served another purpose: discipline. In a world where Confucian ideals governed the state order, restraint, harmony, tea offered a way to practice those values physically. It taught control. A young bureaucrat who could master tea service was seen as steady, reliable, respectable. Even in monasteries, tea was a training ground. Monks practiced cha dao, the way of tea, as a spiritual discipline. Washing the pot was an act of gratitude. Heating water was a meditation. Pouring was a form of prayer. To serve tea well was to embody serenity. And yet, all of this happened over something so simple. Hot water and leaves. That was the point. Tea didn't need grandeur. It needed attention. And in paying attention to temperature, to timing, to silence, the drinker became something else. More aware, more composed, less distracted. It's easy to forget this today, when tea comes in paper cups or foil bags. But for much of Chinese history, tea was a daily reminder that life's texture lies in its slowness, in the pause between sips, in the hand that steadies the pot, in the stillness that precedes the steam. In the next section, we'll step deeper into the politics of tea, how emperors used it to control trade, enforce loyalty, and build a domestic empire as strong as any army. We'll follow the tea horse road, visit the Imperial Tea Bureau, and trace how tea became not just a drink or a ceremony, but a tool of statecraft. Imagine a caravan winding its way through the high mountain passes of western China. The air is thin, the path is narrow, edged with cliffs. Horses, loaded with bricks of tightly packed tea, step carefully in single file. Behind them, traders wrapped in woolen cloaks mutter quiet prayers. They are not travelling for profit alone. They are travelling to sustain an empire. This was the Tea Horse Road, or Chama Gudao, a vast network of trade routes that stretched from the tea-growing regions of Sichuan and Yunnan to the Tibetan Plateau, into Central Asia, and in some cases even further west. It is a road carved not just into rock, but into political history, because by the time tea became ritual, it had already become strategy. Let's step back. During the Tang and Song dynasties, the Chinese court began to realize that tea was more than a drink. It was a tool, especially when it came to foreign relations. Tea was used to pay tribute to powerful regional warlords, to bribe nomadic tribes along the borders, and most famously, to secure alliances with the Tibetan Empire. The Tibetan Plateau was rich in horses, and the Chinese military needed them, especially for its northern cavalry. So in a remarkably long-standing exchange, the Chinese offered tea in exchange for war horses. But not just any tea. These were compressed tea bricks, made of leaves steamed, pressed and dried into dense, easily portable forms. Some were stamped with imperial seals, others bore regional emblems. In Tibet, these bricks weren't merely consumed, they were currency. They could be traded, gifted, even used to pay taxes. The deal was simple. The Chinese got horses, the Tibetans got tea, but beneath that transaction was a quiet dependency, one that gave the Chinese court subtle leverage. Controlling tea production meant controlling diplomacy, and so the state created entire institutions to regulate it. By the time of the Ming dynasty, tea was under the oversight of imperial tea bureaus, administrative bodies tasked with overseeing cultivation, harvest, processing, and distribution. In some regions, farmers were required to pay taxes in tea. In others, elite families were granted monopoly rights to grow certain strains. Tea moved under official guard. Its price was set by bureaucrats. Its leaves were inspected for quality, and this control extended inward too. Inside the empire, tea became a domestic political tool. Court ceremonies featured formal tea offerings. Promotions were sometimes announced over tea gatherings. Even civil service exams occasionally involved tea etiquette, because how you poured might say more about your judgment than what you wrote. For example, one official record from the early Ming mentions a provincial governor who offended the emperor, not with words but by serving inferior tea in a cracked porcelain cup. He was dismissed within a week. Tea was not simply hospitality, it was code. And perhaps nowhere was that code more finely written than in porcelain. You see, as tea evolved from medicine to art, so too did the vessels that contained it. The Chinese didn't just invent tea culture, they invented the cups, pots and bowls that shaped it. In Jingdezhen, often called the porcelain capital, imperial kilns worked year-round to produce teawares for court and diplomacy. Thin, pale blue cups designed to show off the colour of green tea, small pots of yixing clay, chosen for their heat retention and flavour-enhancing properties, bowls made to cradle both the tea and the hand. These were not trinkets, they were statements. To receive an imperial tea set was to be acknowledged, trusted, honoured, folded into the empire's cultural embrace. Porcelain became diplomacy, the same way modern states gift flags or medals. The Ming court gifted teapots. Even abroad, this strategy continued. As maritime trade expanded in the 15th and 16th centuries, tea and porcelain travelled together first to Korea and Japan, then to Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and eventually to Europe. Wherever it landed, it carried a whisper of imperial order. And this trade wasn't just economic, it was cultural encoding. Drinking tea from a Chinese cup, in Chinese style, prepared with Chinese tools, was a subtle acknowledgement of cultural hierarchy, one that was embraced as eagerly by Japanese Zen monks as it was by Portuguese traders. But for the Chinese court, all of this stemmed from a central belief that tea was more than a product. It was a way of disciplining desire. In an age of growing wealth, tea reminded you to slow down. In a court of intrigue, tea reminded you to listen. In a country of vast distances, tea connected regions with taste, ritual and routine. It was internal diplomacy. A cup passed not across a map, but across a table, between families, between officials, between emperor and subject. By the Qing dynasty, entire books had been written on tea preparation, tea architecture, tea's role in literature and health. Tea houses had become gathering points for artists and rebels alike, places where politics simmered just under the lid of the pot. And yet, always the same steps. Boil, pour, wait, sip. A ritual of patience embedded within an empire of motion. In the next section, we'll follow tea beyond China's borders into Japan, Europe, and eventually colonial plantations where this delicate symbol of refinement became an engine of empire building, exploitation, and global trade. We'll trace how a practice of quiet power became a commodity, and how the ceremony, in some places, was preserved, while in others, it was boiled down to dust in a bag. By the 18th century, a strange thing had happened. What once began as a sacred moment in a Chinese courtyard, tea leaves unfurling in hot water under the gaze of a patient host, had become the cargo of empires. Bales of leaves packed into ships, crates labelled with Chinese characters piled high in London docks. Tea was no longer just a ritual of refinement, it was a resource, a revenue stream, and a reason for conquest. Let's trace the journey, from stillness to steamship. In China, tea had long been a controlled substance, taxed, weighed, and measured. It had moved through the empire as tribute and diplomacy. But in the 17th century, as European ships began to arrive in greater numbers, something shifted. Portugal was among the first, followed by the Dutch, and then, decisively, the British. At first, tea was a curiosity in Europe. Expensive, bitter, exotic. Only the aristocracy could afford it. But soon it became a staple. Especially in England, tea houses opened. Teapots were imported in droves. Recipes circulated for proper tea preparation. The aristocratic ritual of tea drinking became a middle-class obsession, and it was all imported from China. For the British East India Company, this presented a problem. China didn't want British goods in return. The balance of trade was heavily tilted. Britain was sending out silver, receiving tea in return, and losing money. The solution was opium. In one of history's most cynical trade arrangements, the British began flooding southern China with opium grown in India, creating a demand so intense it devastated communities. In exchange, They acquired the silver needed to buy more tea. This unsustainable cycle led to the Opium Wars, 1839-42 and 1856-60, in which Britain fought not to defend borders, but to protect its drug-based tea trade. After China's defeat, the Treaty of Nanking opened new ports, ceded Hong Kong, and forced a weakened Qing dynasty to accommodate British commerce, including tea exports. In this way, the quiet Chinese tea ceremony helped fuel global conflict, not by its nature, but by its desirability. Yet even as tea became an instrument of empire, the Chinese practice of patient preparation endured. In homes, in monasteries, in private gardens, the rituals continued, unchanged, unfussed. The water still boiled, the hands still poured, the leaves still opened. Meanwhile, the British wanted to cut China out of the equation entirely, and so they stole tea. In the 1840s, botanist spy Robert Fortune was sent by the British East India Company to infiltrate Chinese tea-growing regions, collect plants and smuggle them to India. Disguised in Mandarin robes, he gathered seedlings and tea processing knowledge from Chinese farmers. The result? Tea plantations in Assam and Darjeeling, entire regions transformed into colonial monocultures, where Indian labourers, often under brutal conditions, grew tea, not for themselves but for export to the British market. Gone were the rituals. Tea in this context was not measured by aroma or texture, but by yield, speed and price. The leaf was shredded, the process industrialised. The result? Tea bags, low-grade blends, black tea boiled with milk and sugar, a far cry from the serene discipline of gongfu brewing. And yet, even in this global commodification, traces of the ceremony remained. In Japan, tea rituals were evolving independently. The chanoyu, or Japanese tea ceremony, developed its own highly formalized version of tea service, rooted in Zen aesthetics. Influenced by Chinese monks but adapted to Japanese philosophy, it emphasized wabi-sabi, beauty and imperfection, transience and simplicity. In Britain, the afternoon tea ritual, though different in pace and tone, mirrored some of the same ideals, taking time, arranging the setting, observing small refinements of social behavior. It was no longer about harmony with nature, but about status, elegance, and control. And in modern China, after the disruptions of the 20th century, revolutions, wars, and political upheaval, the tea ceremony has quietly returned. Not everywhere, and not always in full form, but in households, in tea houses, and among new generations eager to reconnect with the rituals of presence. So what does all of this leave us with? A story that began in silence, ends in commerce. A leaf that once floated in a hand-thrown porcelain cup, now spins in a mug in an office cubicle. But the deeper essence, the discipline of attention, the gesture of offering, the rhythm of heat and rest, has not been entirely lost, because somewhere, even now, someone is pouring tea slowly, feeling the weight of the pot, listening for the hiss before the pour, waiting, just a moment, before that first sip, and in that stillness, no matter the century or the empire, the ceremony begins again. It is long past sunset in a stone-walled monastery somewhere in northern France, perhaps around the year 1170. The countryside is silent, except for the distant hoot of an owl. Inside, the hearths are dark. The only glow comes from the moon slipping through high-arched windows, and yet the monks are waking up, not for breakfast, not for chores, but for prayer, because in the monastic life of the Middle Ages, night was not for sleep. Not entirely. It was a time for discipline, watchfulness, and what they called vigils of the soul. You might imagine a monk's life as quiet, orderly and simple, and in many ways it was. But behind that stillness was a daily and nightly routine, so precisely structured, so physically taxing, and so spiritually relentless that modern sleep researchers have written papers on it. Let's explore one night in the life of a monk, not just as a pious ritual, but as a kind of spiritual choreography performed by candlelight, with aching knees and disciplined hearts. The day technically began before sunrise, but our story starts the night before. After the evening meal, typically a bowl of pottage or bread with ale, the monks gathered in the chapter house, a room where rules were read, faults confessed and punishments assigned. Then came Compline, the last of the daily services, sung in low, murmuring Latin. After this, they were expected to keep silence. No idle talk, no laughter. They retired to the dormitory, A long, cold room with rows of narrow beds, more like hard benches really, each monk sleeping fully clothed, often without blankets, sometimes even upright, depending on the order. But they did not sleep long. At around 2 a.m., a bell rang, loud, echoing, designed not to be ignored. This was the call to matins, the first and longest of the night's prayer services. Bleary-eyed and barefoot, the monks rose in the dark. There was no pause to stretch, no time for personal reflection. They moved in silence, down stone corridors, into the choir stalls of the chapel or cloister. The only sound, footsteps, and the occasional clearing of a throat. There, under flickering candlelight, they chanted psalms, slowly, methodically, for an hour or more. Some monasteries, like the Cluniac order, added extra hymns and readings, stretching matins well into lards, the next service, just before dawn. Altogether, from the moment the monks woke in the middle of the night to the moment they left the chapel, they might be standing or kneeling for 2 to 3 hours. Now, you may be wondering, why? Why interrupt sleep for chanting in the cold? Because for monks, nighttime was sacred. It was the hour when distractions fell away, when temptation slept, when the soul could turn inward. The Psalms themselves say, "At midnight I rise to give you thanks." Medieval monasticism took that literally. To sleep through the night was in some traditions considered slothful, in others, even spiritually dangerous. Night was when monks proved their vigilance, their readiness to meet God in stillness, in discomfort, in effort. And yet, this wasn't unique to one region or century. Monastic rules across Europe, from the rule of Saint Benedict to the Cistercian reforms, emphasized nightly prayer as the spine of devotion. The rule of Saint Benedict to the Cistercian reforms. Benedict, written in the 6th century but influential for over 1,000 years, laid out a schedule that divided the day and night into 8 canonical hours. These were the anchor points of a monk's existence, spaced like stepping stones through every 24-hour period. The night watches, matins and lards, were seen as the most meaningful. They were long, dark, and inconvenient by design. Comfort, after all, was not the goal. After matins, monks returned to bed, but only briefly. Depending on the order and the season, they might get 1 or 2 more hours of rest before rising again for prime, the early morning prayer service around 6 a.m. So in total, a monk might sleep in 2 or 3 short segments, a few hours in the evening, a break for matins, then a nap before dawn. This pattern of segmented sleep, once considered uniquely monastic, has since been observed in many pre-industrial societies. Some historians now argue that interrupted sleep, once thought pathological, is actually deeply human, a time when the brain dreams differently, the body repairs, and the mind floats in a space between sleep and wakefulness. For monks, this was a feature, not a flaw. Some even embraced the wakeful hours between matins and prime as a time for private prayer, meditation, or silent weeping. The dormitory might be dark, but the mind was awake, working, remembering, offering, and occasionally nodding off again on a hard wooden bench. In the next section, we'll follow the monks into the daylight hours where sleep deprivation meets a demanding schedule of work, scripture, silence, and more prayer. We'll explore the rhythm of bells, the peculiar rules of mealtime, and how monks coped with exhaustion in a world where naps were forbidden, but meditative stillness was quietly tolerated. The bell tolls again, not as harsh as matins, but enough to stir the dormitory. The monks rise for prime, the first hour of the working day. Though it's still early, just after dawn, their limbs are stiff, their feet are cold. Some move slowly, rubbing their eyes, but the rule calls, and the bells leave no room for negotiation. Sleep was already sparse, but from here on out, the real discipline begins. Because while we may imagine monks gliding through days of quiet contemplation, their actual schedules were a masterclass in fatigue management, one that forbade naps, limited conversation, and demanded constant spiritual attention, even when one's knees were sore and eyelids heavy. Let's walk through one of those days, hour by quiet hour. After prime comes terce, the third canonical hour, around 9 a.m. By now the monks have been up for several hours with little to eat and no rest but what fit between midnight prayer and dawn. Terce is shorter than matins but no less serious. More psalms, more kneeling, more cold stone beneath the feet. Then finally, manual labour begins. Depending on the order and the size of the monastery, this might mean gardening, scribing manuscripts, mending clothing, making candles, brewing ale, or tending animals. In Cistercian communities, famed for their rigor, the work was hard and physical. In Benedictine abbeys, it often leaned toward literacy, copying Latin texts, illuminating psalters, cataloguing the library. All this with no talking. Most monks took vows of silence. Not absolute, but carefully structured. Speech was reserved for necessary instruction, and even then, whispered or conducted in Latin. The rest of the time, monks communicated using hand signs, a full symbolic language developed to convey concepts like, "I need a candle," "pass the bread," or "I have broken my fast by accident and feel deeply ashamed." This silence had a spiritual purpose. It stilled the soul, but it also had a practical side. It helped keep drowsy monks from chatting their way into distraction. Still, exhaustion found its way in. There are reports, particularly from later monastic chroniclers, of monks nodding off during services, especially the long daytime ones like sext, midday, or none, mid-afternoon. Drowsiness was expected. It was rarely punished harshly, but it was discouraged, and some monasteries took subtle measures, like keeping the chapel very cold, or using uncomfortable choir stalls with seats that flipped forward if a monk leaned too far. Some monks even stood during certain prayers, purely to stay alert. Interestingly, despite all this fatigue, naps were not allowed. The rule of Saint Benedict makes no mention of rest periods beyond night and very early afternoon. Even when monks were elderly or sick, they were expected to attend the hours unless utterly incapacitated. However, loopholes existed. Some monks practiced a form of holy stillness, remaining in a seated position with eyes closed, perhaps with a hand over their face. Not sleeping, they insisted, merely meditating, and as long as they awoke in time for the next bell, no one questioned it too closely. This leads us to mealtime. Meals were silent too. Lunch taken after sex was often the day's only proper meal. It might include pottage, bread, and weak ale. On feast days, perhaps cheese or a boiled egg. Meat was largely forbidden, except for the sick. Even fish was a treat. The monks ate side by side in the refectory, seated on benches, with their food served in shared bowls. While they ate, one monk read aloud from scripture, or from a book of saints' lives. Everyone listened, chewed slowly, and did not speak. It was said that hearing holy words while eating nourished the soul as well as the body. After the meal, they gathered for none. The 9th hour, around 3 p.m. Then came more work, more prayer, more silence. Finally, after Vespers, the evening prayer, the day began to wind down. The monks might take a short walk in the cloister, in pairs, in silence. They might read, they might review their assigned psalms for the next morning, and then, just before dark, they attended Compline, the last service of the day. By now they were exhausted, but sleep would be brief, because matins would ring again just after midnight. And so they climbed back into their hard beds, not fully undressing, not fully resting, but entering a kind of half-sleep, knowing they would rise again. This was not punishment, it was practice. A daily rehearsal of dying and waking, of closing the eyes in faith, and opening them in vigilance. The rhythm of sleep and wake was not about rest, it was about readiness. Readiness for death, readiness for prayer, readiness for the God who might arrive at any hour. In the final section, we'll explore how sleep deprivation became a virtue, how monks viewed drowsiness as both a trial and a blessing, how dreams were interpreted, and how some mystics believed sleepless nights brought them closer to the divine. We'll also trace the legacy of these routines in modern monastic life, and what we might learn, oddly enough, about sleep from those who gave it up. By now you know, monks didn't get much sleep, but here's the surprising part. They didn't see that as a problem. In fact, they often saw it as a gift, a way to test the soul, tame the body, and get closer to the divine. In an age before alarm clocks and blackout curtains, medieval monks became perhaps the most disciplined sleepers in human history, not despite their tiredness, but because of it. Sleepiness was not a sign of weakness. It was a reminder of the flesh, of the body's demands, and of the monk's daily decision to put eternity above comfort. Let's sit beside one of them now. It's midnight again. The bell rings for matins. The monk, barely dozing, rises. He's cold, bleary-eyed. His joints ache. But he goes because he's expected to. Because it's what was done. because it is in this faltering, not in strength, that holiness is shaped. Throughout monastic writings, from abbots' letters to monks' personal diaries, you'll find scattered references to the struggle of staying awake during prayers. They don't deny it. In fact, they often describe it with honesty, nodding off during psalms, leaning against the wall, losing one's place in the liturgy. But instead of punishing themselves harshly, they framed it as a spiritual training ground. Saint Benedict himself, in his famous rule, cautions abbots not to be too severe with weary brothers, especially the elderly. The goal was not perfection, but perseverance. Over time, monks came to believe that sleepiness itself was a kind of offering, to chant psalms while your body begged for rest, to remain standing when your knees wobbled, to pour water from a jug in the sacristy, while blinking away tears of fatigue. These were acts of devotion, not failures, because in those bleary, quiet hours, the monk became most vulnerable, most human, and for many mystics that was exactly the point. Some monastic writers, especially those influenced by mystical theology, even suggested that the state between sleep and wakefulness, that fragile moment before one nods off, was a privileged place for divine encounter. Visions, dreams, and subtle movements of the spirit were said to occur, not in full consciousness, but in this half-lit realm. The drowsy mind was looser, humbler, more receptive, less tangled in pride, more open to grace. This idea finds support in stories of saints and hermits who, after long vigils, reported moments of extraordinary insight, what we might now call hypnagogic visions. They were not dreaming, exactly, but neither were they fully awake, and in that space they claimed to feel the presence of God more clearly. Consider the writings of Goigo II, a 12th century Carthusian monk who described the ladder of contemplation as beginning in reading, rising through meditation, then prayer, and finally reaching a level beyond words, where the soul simply rests in God. This rest was not sleep, but it was not fully awake either, and so the monks, exhausted, half sleeping, half praying, began to see even their weariness as part of a sacred rhythm. Over time, monastic orders developed subtle ways to accommodate fatigue without encouraging indulgence. The Cistercians, known for their rigor, eventually allowed elderly monks to sit during some prayers. In colder climates, some abbeys installed low stone shelves in the choir stalls, not to lean on but to rest an arm during long vigils. Even the rule of Saint Benedict includes short naps during the summer, a concession to both heat and long daylight hours. But always, the goal was to keep going, to continue praying, to rise when called, to obey the bell. And what about dreams? For monks, dreams were a mysterious territory, not quite divine, not quite dangerous. Most monastic rules discouraged speaking of them openly, to avoid pride or superstition. But in private writings, some monks did record vivid dream imagery: angels, rivers, open books, fire, light, and wondered whether these were messages or simply echoes of the mind. Dreams were neither pursued nor ignored. They were received, quietly, like all else. But perhaps the most profound part of this entire sleep-deprived life was its intentionality. The monks chose it. They chose to rise at 2 a.m. They chose to go without blankets. They chose to stand for psalms, while swaying from fatigue, not because it made them stronger, not because it made them holier in some measurable way, but because it was a form of love, a daily, nightly, bodily love, expressed not in grand gestures, but in repetition, restraint, and yes, even in sleep deprivation. Today, the strictest monastic schedules have softened. Few orders wake in the middle of the night anymore. Most have consolidated their prayers. Electric light, central heating, and medical care have made sleep more manageable. Silence is still kept, but rarely total. And yet, in some remote monasteries, especially among the Carthusians, the night still divides. The bell still rings, the monks still rise, still chant, still kneel, still offer their weariness, hour by hour, to something beyond rest. So the next time you wake up in the dark and wonder what time it is, imagine a monk, 10 centuries ago, standing barefoot on a cold stone floor, whispering the psalms into the candlelight, not because he has to, but because for him it was the most meaningful way to spend the quietest hour of the night.